Jury is about to hear the defendant's 911 call.
Sarah, I can't breathe, babe.
On the morning of February 24, 2020, a woman in Winter Park, Florida, called 911 and told the dispatcher that her boyfriend was dead. Her name was Sarah Boone. The man on the floor was Jorge Torres Jr. At first, Sarah's explanation sounded strange, but almost accidental. She said they had been drinking. She said they had been playing hide and seek. She said Jorge had climbed into a suitcase as part of the game. She said she zipped it up, went upstairs, and fell asleep. By the time she woke up the next morning, she said, Jorge was still inside the suitcase. He was not moving. But detectives soon found 2 videos on Sarah's phone. In those videos, Jorge could be heard pleading that he could not breathe, while Sarah recorded from outside the suitcase. That discovery changed everything. What began as a bizarre story about a drunken game became one of the most disturbing murder trials in Florida. A case built on a 911 call, a police interrogation, body cam footage, cell phone videos, courtroom testimony, and one blue suitcase. Sarah Boone and Jorge Torres Jr. lived together in a residence in Winter Park, just north of Orlando. Their relationship was complicated long before the night of Jorge's death. At trial, both sides talked about conflict, alcohol, arguments, and previous police responses. The prosecution wanted jurors to focus on what Sarah did on the night Jorge died. The defense wanted jurors to understand the relationship as one shaped by domestic violence and fear. That tension would become the heart of the trial. To the state, Sarah was not a scared woman who made a terrible mistake. She was someone who zipped a man into a suitcase, heard him begging, recorded him, and left him there. To the defense, Sarah was a woman who had suffered repeated violence and believed Jorge could hurt her if she let him out. But one fact was not in dispute. Jorge Torres died inside a suitcase, and Sarah Boone was the person who zipped it closed. According to Sarah's initial explanation to detectives, the night began with alcohol and a game. She said she and Jorge had been drinking wine. At some point, she said, they started playing hide and seek. The idea of Jorge getting into a suitcase was presented as a joke. Sarah said they were laughing. She said she zipped the suitcase. She said she believed Jorge could get out on his own. Then, she said, she went upstairs and fell asleep. That version made the death sound like a horrible accident. 2 intoxicated adults, a reckless game, and a fatal mistake. But there were immediate problems. Why did Sarah not let him out when he called for her? Why did she record videos instead of helping? Why did she later say she did not remember recording them? And if Jorge was truly able to get out, why was he still inside the suitcase the next morning? These questions did not disappear. They became the center of the case. The next morning, Sarah called her ex-husband first. According to trial testimony, he told her to call 911. When the emergency call came in, the situation was already beyond help. Sarah told the dispatcher that Jorge had blood coming from his mouth. She described him as discolored. She was given CPR instructions. When deputies arrived, their body cameras recorded the first official look at the scene. The suitcase was there. Jorge was there. Sarah was there. In many true crime cases, the first call is the first time the audience hears panic. In this case, the 911 call became something else. It became the beginning of the record that jurors would later examine in court. After the first response, detectives needed Sarah to explain the timeline. How long had Jorge been inside the suitcase? Why did she go upstairs? Why did she not check on him? Why were there videos on her phone? And what did she remember from the night before? During the interrogation, Sarah maintained that she did not intend for Jorge to die. She framed the suitcase as part of a game that went wrong. But detectives had already seen something that made the story much harder to accept. The phone videos. The videos did not show a man silently trapped while Sarah slept upstairs. They showed Jorge calling out while Sarah was awake, close enough to hear him, and holding the phone. The 2 phone videos became the most important evidence in the case. They showed that Sarah was not simply asleep while Jorge was trapped, she was awake. She was recording. Jorge could be heard saying he could not breathe. He called out to Sarah. The suitcase moved. He was still alive. Instead of opening it, Sarah responded from outside. Prosecutors argued that the videos showed awareness, anger, and control. They argued that Sarah heard Jorge, understood he was trapped, and chose not to help. For the defense, the videos were explained through fear, intoxication, and the history of the relationship. Sarah would later testify that she believed Jorge might get out and attack her. But for the jury, the videos created a brutal question. If someone is begging to breathe and the person outside the suitcase does not open it, is that an accident? The medical and physical evidence made the situation even more serious. An autopsy found that Jorge had injuries in addition to asphyxiation. Reports described scratches, bruising, and blunt force injuries. Sarah was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The state did not have to prove that Sarah planned the death days in advance. The charge focused on what she did in the moment. Zip Jorge inside, leave him trapped, hear him pleading, record him, and fail to help. Prosecutors would later argue that Jorge did not die because of a harmless game. He died because Sarah left him in a position where he could not breathe. And the phone videos, to the state, showed she knew exactly how desperate that situation was. Sarah Boone was arrested in 2020, but her trial did not begin until 2024. In the years between, the case became known not only for the suitcase video, but for delays, changing attorneys, and Sarah's handwritten letters to the court. She went through multiple lawyers. Some withdrew. Others were removed. The court eventually had to manage a case where the legal process itself became part of the story. For viewers, this matters because it explains why a 2020 death became a major 2024 trial. By the time Sarah finally faced a jury, the evidence was no longer new. But the courtroom was about to hear it all in one place. The 911 call, the body cam, the interrogation, the phone videos, the relationship history, and Sarah Boone's own testimony. When the trial began, the jury heard two very different versions of Sarah Boone. The prosecution presented her as someone who had the power to save Jorge and chose not to. In opening statements, the state focused on the videos, the 911 call, the suitcase, and Sarah's words after Jorge asked for help. The defense presented Sarah as a survivor of domestic violence. Her attorney argued that she had suffered repeated physical violence from Jorge, and that her actions that night had to be understood through fear, alcohol, and trauma. The same evidence was being pulled in opposite directions. To the state, the suitcase was a murder weapon. To the defense, it was the center of a panic response by someone who believed she was not safe. That was the question the jury would have to answer. Was Sarah Boone acting in fear, or was she acting with a depraved disregard for Jorge's life? The trial moved through the evidence step by step. Jurors heard the 911 call. They saw body cam footage from the deputy who responded to the apartment. They saw the suitcase itself in court. They also heard from people who knew the couple or responded to earlier incidents. Then the state introduced messages and videos from Sarah's phone. This was where the case became difficult to watch. The prosecution did not need to ask the jury to imagine what happened. They could show parts of it. The texts gave context. The videos gave sound. The suitcase gave the physical reality of the space Jorge was trapped inside. For the audience, this is where the story should slow down. The editor should let the courtroom evidence breathe, but not exploit it. Every clip should answer one question. What did the jury see that made this more than an accident? Then Sarah Boone took the stand in her own defense. For the first time, jurors heard her explain the night directly. She described the hide-and-seek game. She described Jorge getting into the suitcase. She said she could not believe he could fit inside. She also talked about fear. She testified about prior violence and said she believed Jorge might hurt her if he got out. But cross-examination brought the case back to the simplest question. Did she open the suitcase? Did she help him? Did she call 911 that night? At one point, when asked whether she did anything to help Jorge escape the situation she had zipped him into, she answered, no. That answer was short, but in the context of the entire case, it was devastating. The defense did not deny that Sarah zipped the suitcase. Instead, the defense tried to explain why. Jurors heard about prior incidents between Sarah and Jorge. They saw body cam and phone videos connected to previous domestic violence allegations. The defense also called expert testimony related to battered spouse syndrome. This part of the trial was important because it gave the jury a possible explanation for Sarah's fear. But the prosecution argued that fear did not explain everything. It did not explain why Sarah recorded Jorge. It did not explain why she went upstairs. It did not explain why she waited until the next morning to call 911. And it did not erase the fact that Jorge was trapped, asking for help, and unable to breathe. By closing arguments, the case had narrowed to one question. What did Sarah Boone understand when Jorge was inside the suitcase? The state told jurors that Jorge took his last panicked breaths inside that box. Prosecutors argued that the evidence showed Sarah knew he was trapped, knew he was begging, and still did not help. The defense argued that the state had simplified a complicated relationship. Sarah's attorney asked the jury to consider fear, trauma, intoxication, and self-defense. But the jury did not need to decide whether the relationship was perfect. It clearly was not. They had to decide whether Sarah Boone was criminally responsible for leaving Jorge Torres inside that suitcase until he died. After days of testimony, the jurors left the courtroom to deliberate. The jury did not take long. After less than 2 hours of deliberation, they returned with a verdict. Sarah Boone was found guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Jorge Torres Jr. For the Torres family, it was not a victory in the usual sense. It could not bring Jorge back, but it was an answer. The suitcase was not treated as a tragic accident. The jury found that Sarah Boone was responsible for Jorge's death. On December 2, 2024, Sarah Boone returned to court for sentencing. Before the judge announced the sentence, Jorge Torres' family spoke. Their statements brought the case back to the person at its center. Not a suitcase, not a viral courtroom clip, but a man whose life ended in terror. Sarah also spoke. She asked for forgiveness. But she also continued to describe Jorge as abusive and portrayed herself as someone who had survived him. The judge sentenced Sarah Boone to life in prison. The long pretrial history, the shifting defense strategies, the letters, the delays, the testimony, the phone videos, the 911 call, all of it ended with a life sentence. The Sarah Boone case is disturbing because the explanation sounds almost absurd at first. A game of hide and seek, a suitcase, a night of drinking, a woman who says she fell asleep. But the evidence turned that explanation inside out. There was a 911 call. There was bodycam footage. There was a police interrogation. There were text messages. There was a suitcase shown to the jury. There was testimony about violence, fear, alcohol, and control. And there were videos from Sarah's own phone. Those videos are why this case could never remain a strange accident story. Jorge Torres was not simply found dead in a suitcase. He was heard asking for help from inside it. And Sarah Boone was outside, close enough to hear him, close enough to record him, and close enough to open it. She did not. That is what the jury ultimately decided. And that is why Sarah Boone will spend the rest of her life in prison.